Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Chinese President Xi Jinping has wrapped up his two-day visit to Vietnam, his first in 6 years. The two sides signed over 30 agreements in a variety of fields and agreed to build a community with a shared future. What are the highlights of the visit? What's in there for both countries to upgrade their relationship? And how important is the relationship to the two socialist countries? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by Nguyen Khac Giang, visiting fellow of Vietnam Studies program of ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore, Victor Gao Zhikai, chair professor of Soochow University, and Rosario Malindog-Uy, director and vice president for External Affairs of the Asian Century Philippines Strategic Studies Institute, and Marco Förster, head of ASEAN Advisory of Dezan Shira Associates. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to Dialogue. I will start with Zhang from Hanoi. Zhang, this is an important visit, of course, first in 6 years by the Chinese leader. So people would ask, what's in there for both countries? They have a lot of in common. Both are socialist countries. They have similar ideals or same ideals. They are in the process of reform, priority of developing their countries. So what does this visit mean to Vietnam, for example, here?
Well, I think the timing of President Xi Jinping visit to Vietnam is very important because it follows a very successful years of Vietnamese diplomacy effort. Especially 3 months ago, U.S. President Joe Biden also came to Hanoi and upgraded the bilateral relationship with Vietnam. And just a month ago, Vietnam also upgraded the relationship with Japan. So this concludes a very successful year for Vietnam in terms of foreign policy. But more importantly, I think this visit is very important because it strengthens the ties between Vietnam and China, especially in times of global crisis. There will be a need for both countries to tighten their similarities and try to solve the disputes in a more consensus way and try to promote peace and security in the region. So I think for Vietnam itself, it is important in terms of foreign policy, important in promoting economic ties with China, and important in trying to create a more peaceful environment for development in Vietnam and also in the wider Southeast Asia region.
It seems important for two countries, but also for the region. And Marco, you are in the business sector. Share with us, how important in terms of the trade and economic relationship, for both sides.
Yes, definitely. So China is Vietnam's largest trading partner overall and has been for many years. And on the same way, on the other way around, Vietnam is China's 8th largest trading partner, but largest trading partner in Southeast Asia. When we look at the proximity, when we look at the border region between China, southern China and northern Vietnam, that's the most densely populated border that China has. And China has over 14 borders with sovereign states. And it's also the most heavily industrialized border. So I think during this trade talk and this general diplomatic talk, the question will be how much will really happen in terms of cross-border facilitation between the two countries, and how much more can we enhance the easy and the better flow of goods between the two countries, and especially that important corridor and the most important corridor between China toward ASEAN, I would say.
Important corridor, not only, of course, between the two countries, but also to ASEAN. Victor, as we said earlier, the two countries are both socialist, and they call each other like comrades and brothers. They are neighbors, they are partners. They have a lot of similarities in their own development, let's say, path. So how important is it for China in terms of the relationship, the Vietnam relationship, economically, diplomatically here?
Thank you very much for having me. First of all, let's congratulate this highly successful landmark visit by the Chinese President Xi Jinping to Vietnam. From the Chinese perspective, Vietnam is very important in several ways. First of all, China and Vietnam are neighbors. We not only share land boundary between us, we also share a maritime boundary with us. And there are some territorial disputes which need to be resolved through wisdom, through diplomacy, through negotiation in due course. Secondly, we are trading with each other, and China-Vietnam trade has been increasing in the recent years and will further increase in the future. Now, the third point, which is equally important, is that I expect that there will be a lot of industrial cooperation and coordination in the coming years and decades, because China and Vietnam today are at very different stages of industrial development in terms of technological breakthroughs, etc. And I would say better industrial policy between these two countries will be a huge benefit, not only for Vietnam, but equally importantly for China. And further, people-to-people exchanges will be absolutely important, because these two peoples, these two nations, are different in many ways, but they also have a lot of historical background which should make them proud of each other and recommit themselves to greater cooperation and exchanges going forward. So the future prospect of China-Vietnam cooperation is continuously on the rise.
Mm-hmm. And you're also from the region, with a stable and also, let's say, a prosperous relationship between Beijing and Hanoi. What does it mean, to this entire region, to ASEAN?
I think just to give a little bit of my impression as to the recent visit of Chinese President Xi Jinping to Vietnam. First and foremost, I think it's very significant for both nations. It signifies an upgrade in the bilateral relation between the two countries. Second is also when you talk about relationship between China and Vietnam in relation to ASEAN, that also signifies that, in ASEAN, ASEAN countries is like, for example, Vietnam has good relation with China, and I think it's a good thing for the region itself. And when it comes to relationship of Vietnam with China and the rest of other major players in the region, like the United States, we can see, and it's a reflection as well of many other countries in ASEAN, that it's striking a balance, and it has a balancing act between the two superpowers, that it's pursuing a multidimensional kind of foreign policy, an independent foreign policy, and that is a reflection actually of many countries in ASEAN, and I think that's good for ASEAN for the region, for that matter.
Mm-hmm. But I would say it's probably also for the benefits of Vietnam itself. Of course, we will touch upon that a little bit. International perspective about balancing the relationship with big powers here, China and the U.S. But before that, Zhang, if you look at the upgrading of a relationship from a previously comprehensive, strategic partnership to this, let's say, both sides agree to build a China-Vietnam community with a shared future, with a strategic importance here. So what's your reading of this upgrading of relationship here?
Well, I think for Vietnam and for China, it's very important milestone, because for Vietnam, China has always been the most important country, in bilateral relations, and Vietnam has always tried to balance a very, very delicately between China and other countries. So when China and Vietnam both agreed to upgrade their ties to the community of with shared future, I think it signifies the political confidence between the two parties and the two countries. And secondly, it will create a very strong framework for economic and cultural exchanges between the two countries. And I think for the past 40 years, with China's market reforms and Vietnamese market reforms, economic and cultural exchanges are probably the most important and are the foundation of good relationships between the countries. And I think from now on, with a new agreement on a community with a shared future, a lot of focus on economic cooperation. There would be more and intensify cooperation effort between Vietnam and China in terms of economic and cultural exchanges.
Mm-hmm. Well, Marco, earlier you mentioned about these border facilities, border crossing border let's say, transfer of goods and people, and of course, products there. Tell us more about that. We know that among the 30-plus agreements signed between the two sides, some of them are about digital cooperation, some of them about a real link. Obviously, people are talking about more investment to build the link between a Chinese city in Kunming and, of course, a Vietnam city. That will, people believe, will facilitate more trade between the two sides.
Yeah, I think the two agreements on the rail links are really the ones that stand out here. And these are only MOUs so far, but once we got the two authorities talking to another, I hope that there will be more pledges and promises being made on the actual rail link establishment. As I just mentioned earlier, Vietnam and China's border is the most industrialized and most densely populated. And ASEAN is no longer China's backyard, but appears to be China's front yard now. And the Vietnam-China corridor, as I also said, is the gateway for that and all that supply chain diversification that is happening. So it needs stronger infrastructure investment. What we see when we consult with our clients, a lot of our clients have been our clients in China for over 30 years now, producing, for example, in Guangdong and South China, also looking at China plus one or China plus two strategies. They are really seeing Northern Vietnam as the only region in Southeast Asia where they can easily connect the supply chain via truck within 24 hours. There's no other way, or when we look at the Kunming, Laos railway, high-speed railway, these are two less industrial areas in terms of Southeast Asia, but also Yunnan is not as industrial as, for example, southern China and Guangdong and Guangxi. So it's really crucial to establish a stronger railway connection between these two regions. Earlier this year, there have been further advancements. For example, connecting the Hanoi freight train directly with Shijiazhuang in Hebei province. These products have never gone that up north before toward China. However, these are very few, or these existing railway lines can only ship so much cargo. So it needs a proper infrastructure investment to tap into this huge potential and demand that is there right now.
It's like I would say, it's a sweet problem, You have a challenge, but it's a good challenge in the sense because it's about more development. The Chinese, for them, one of the popular destinations is Vietnam. Of course, Vietnamese students, they come to China for further studies. There is a need, a demand for more, let's say, closer cooperation, either physically or, the communication, people-to-people communication over there. So Victor here, obviously Vietnam is important not only to China, to this, but also to this region in terms of China-ASEAN relationship, as Marco said, not ASEAN not a backyard anymore, but a frontier yard for China here. So in a sense, it reflects a growing importance for this region to China, let's say?
Absolutely. I think ASEAN as a whole, including Vietnam, will become more and more important in the coming years and decades. And if we look at the geography of Vietnam, Vietnam is one of the longest and narrowest countries in the world. So from the perspective of connectivity, the best way is to build a highly efficient high-speed railway system from the Chinese border all the way to Saigon and connecting with Cambodia, for example. And then Vietnam can also be connected very extensively westward through Laos, through Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar, for example, all the way into the subcontinent through Bangladesh or India or Pakistan, all the way westward. So I think Vietnam should really aim to become a very vibrant, dynamic interconnectivity hub rather than purely Vietnam for Vietnam's development. In that way, I think a lot of productivity and efficiency can be further emancipated, and this will really bode very well for the future of Vietnam. That connectivity through and with Vietnam will also boost the connectivity throughout the ASEAN region. So Vietnam now becomes a very important linchpin in this regional integration and integration network beyond this region, way to the west of Vietnam.
way to the west of Vietnam, and of course, and I want you to talk more about this, perspective on independent foreign policy of many countries in the region. They don't want to choose sides, either with the U.S. or with China, in terms of this, or balancing the relationship between the two big powers here. But at the same time, you do see Vietnam and other countries, they are playing very well, they're basically benefiting from the development or competition, you may say, between the two, China and the U.S. You say investment from Western, businesses, but also growing investment from the Chinese companies, for example, in Vietnam here. So in this sense, we do see more connectivity and probably a strengthened supply chain or industrial chain between China and this region.
Yeah, I think it's very important for countries in ASEAN to strike a balance between, the major powers that are playing in the Asia Pacific region, for it will benefit them. Like, for example, if you look at the bilateral relation between Vietnam and China in the last 15 years, you could see that, with Vietnam's very strategic and balancing act between the United States, let us say, and China, if you look at China and Vietnam relationship, it benefited a lot in terms of trade. As you can see, the first 11 months of this year, the total investment in Vietnam from mainland China and Hong Kong increased to around 8.2 billion US dollar, twice as much in the same period of last year, with mainland China's investment in Vietnam reaching 3.9 billion US dollars. So if you can see, it's very effective for a country like Vietnam to have that balanced relationship, having very good economic relation with China, but at the same time, a friendly relation with the United States. And that also helps in trying to maintain peace and stability in the region. And I hope other countries in ASEAN would have that kind of balancing act, because that's how you play the game if you're not as a big country. But in a way, but Vietnam is actually right now, if you look at ASEAN countries for that matter, it's actually one of the most dynamic and the most robust country in terms of economic development in ASEAN. So this is very important for any country in ASEAN, even for my country, the Philippines, to have that kind of balance, because it benefits that country for that matter.
Benefits that country for that matter. Of course, Zhang, if you look at, talk more about this, bamboo diplomacy. Speak of the flexibility of the Vietnamese policy, foreign policy making toward big players like China, like the U.S. Talk more about that. How do you strike a balance between the two countries? On one hand, Vietnam talked of supporting the One China principle, declaring, Taiwan is part of China. They are against, separatist activities of Taiwan independence in the island. That obviously they are following closely about this One China principle. Well, despite what's happening, that's the U.S. basically changing the status quo over the island, creating tensions there.
Well, I think for Vietnam, flexibility is not the right word, but bamboo diplomacy, in a sense, requires flexibility in actions and solid foundation in principle. So for Vietnam, there are main principles of foreign policy which are independent, respecting UN charters, respecting international laws. For example, so for Vietnam, is bamboo diplomacy is focusing mostly on economic cooperation, on trying to solve other issues according to international laws, and trying to compartmentalize disputes and make way for economic development. So let's say Vietnam and US, for example, are very different in terms of ideologies, right? The US is probably the most successful capitalist country, and Vietnam is among the 5 remaining communist countries, but they still find a way to establish a comprehensive strategic partnership. Vietnam and China, despite the complex history and despite the ongoing maritime disputes, still find ways to enhance economic and trade development, enhance cultural exchanges, and enhance political understanding between the two parties. So for Vietnam, if you can stick to the principles, flexibility in actions will bring benefit to the development.
Well, Victor, I wonder how does the Chinese side see this relationship or the balancing act for Vietnam? I want to make it clear. I think my understanding is like if you look at the Washington, many people would say they want Vietnam on their side against Beijing. But if you look at Beijing, Beijing is simply strengthening ties with Vietnam for its own sake, for bilateral relationship. As the Chinese leader said, China does not engage in, say, bloc politics or camp confrontation. China engages in because, basically free trade globalization, because it benefits China, it benefits countries in the region. I wonder, is that the case here?
Absolutely. My view is that China wants to further engage with Vietnam for peace and mutual development and for maximizing the benefits for both the Chinese people and the Vietnamese people. Now, from Washington's perspective, they may look at Vietnam more, unfortunately, in the geopolitical sense of the word. That is, try to divide and rule, try to stir up more geopolitical tensions, etc. However, whatever Washington wants doesn't matter in the final sense of the word, because eventually you need to listen to the Vietnamese. I would say from Vietnam's perspective, they want to be friends with China, with the United States, with Japan, with Russia, with EU, you name it, which is very legitimate. I think the development of Vietnam's relations with any country, including with China, should not be at the expense of Vietnam's relations with any other country. That means Vietnam-US relations, no matter how they are improved, should not be at the expense of Vietnam-China solidarity, friendship, and cooperation. That should be the litmus test. And I truly have confidence in the wisdom and the courage and the vision of the leaders in Vietnam and the people in Vietnam. They were torn and traumatized by wars for several decades in the past, and China-Vietnam solidarity actually accelerated the unification of Vietnam. This should be a very good historical heritage that both Vietnam and China could benefit from in the coming years. And this whole region, including Vietnam, should really focus on peace rather than being distracted by war. This should be the megatrend in China-Vietnam relations as well as in Vietnam-US relations.
Well, Marco, here we're talking about the geopolitical factor here. How do you think, such a factor might affect or even boost, the economic or trade relationship Vietnam is having with China and with other regional countries, maybe?
So it boosts the trade relationship and especially FDI that goes into Vietnam at the moment. And everyone's saying Vietnam is a winner out of this conflict. However, I would also take that with a grain of salt. Vietnam has historically already been in a position where it needed to please or was squeezed between the world's superpowers, which were the Soviet Union and the US at the time. So Vietnam is tiptoeing a little bit and having this balancing act. But for now, it's reaping fruit, and we hope for the best that it will continue to do so. What we often get from our clients that have existing manufacturing locations and trading operations in China and want to also enter Southeast Asia is that most of the companies don't know much about Southeast Asia and are a little bit confused at how diverse Southeast Asia is and every single country of it. And especially European companies, they oftentimes don't quite understand that ASEAN is not as a strictly governed political body as the EU, for example, where every member state needs to follow guidelines and the rule book, but more so, as Victor said, a community of very independently acting states that came together for promoting, first of all, regional stability, economic growth, and especially peace. And without these three pillars, there's no chance for FDI to enter here more, and there's no chance for this region to thrive. So even though we see in the South China Sea more militarization, I think the status quo should be maintained by all the nations. And the good thing is that the diplomatic route is open and the governments talk, and Xi Jinping is welcome in Vietnam, and the same way goes the other way around. So as long as the talks are there and the enhancements are being planned, and additional trade routes are being opened, I don't think there's too much to worry about on the geopolitical end.
No, too much worries about this geopolitical issues here. With that being said, Anna, you are smiling. Of course, there's this maritime issues, among regional countries, including issues between China and Vietnam here. Both leaders talked about that. They didn't avoid such issues. For example, President Xi mentioned we need to turn those maritime issues into opportunities of cooperation. The Vietnamese side also said, we need to better handle those challenges there. So, what's your understanding? What's the prospect of properly dealing with this disputes over there and keep it as it is, or to solve it peacefully, and then so it will not affect the overall relationship between the two countries here?
Yeah, I think I have no doubt that when you talk about the economic relationship and people-to-people relationship between China and Vietnam, you can see that it's quite solid in many ways and in many senses. And we've been discussing that earlier, and I've been giving you some kind of figures that, even in trade and economic development, economic cooperation between the two countries, you can see that's very, very evident that it's there and it's solid. However, one thing that we don't forget is there's a lot of challenges actually between the two countries too that they're also facing, but I'm not saying that it's not possible to resolve them. But one eminent challenge, I think, that is China and Vietnam, even other claimant states in the South China Sea has to face and think through and probably come up with a very good and solid solution is the dispute in the South China Sea. As you can see, despite dialogue, there's still no comprehensive solution, and tensions are still present due to the overlapping territorial and maritime claims in the South China Sea. So I think I think both countries, China and Vietnam, and even other claimant states of the South China Sea, the way to address that and this challenge is to continue the ongoing diplomatic efforts and put forward confidence-building measures and tangible progress in dispute resolution mechanism. China and Vietnam should continue to seek ways to, improve economic ties and manage territorial dispute while navigating the complex dynamics of regional and global geopolitics and dispute over the South China Sea. And I think one very important aspect when you talk about the South China Sea and how to put forward solutions to that is focus on low politics. When you talk about low politics, meaning focus more on possible cooperation in the South China Sea, like probably oil and gas, joint development, joint fishery management, and even push forward for the early conclusion of the COC, or the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea, because that's very important. As you can see, and as what other resource person in this program have said earlier, if there's no peace and stability and security in the ASEAN region and even in the wider Asia-Pacific region, then economic development will be impossible, because peace and security is the way forward rather than conflict. So I think the imminent challenge of the South China Sea can be resolved, but it takes a lot of pragmatism and open-mindedness for countries like China, Vietnam, and other claimant states to put forward for a stability of the region and for economic prosperity not to be disrupted.
Well, not to be disrupted, and of course, focusing on the economic cooperation, trade cooperation, and probably to control and then find a peaceful ways, or even turning the issues into opportunities. That probably the goal. That should be the goal. Well, with that, we come to the end for today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Shu Qinduo. See you next time.